says, I have noticed my anecdotal. Okay, so this is about the sanctions and whether or not we should be supporting the sanctions on Iran or not, right? So the question is, I have noticed in my experience, in my anecdotal experience, that my friends born and raised in Iran generally support the harsh sanctions and often want them to be even harsher. On the other hand, the people I know that are second generation oppose the sanctions as Western imperialism and see them as US violence against Iran. And they tell me to listen to Iranians. What are your thoughts on this contention? Why do you think there is such a difference in opinions? Okay, so guys, the topic of sanctions on Iran is a very complicated one, right? Because there's no easy answer to this. It is true that the sanctions on Iran is hurting Iranian people as well. It's not just the regime. A lot of Iranian people are suffering because of the sanctions, okay? It's also true that without the sanctions, the regime will have a lot more resources to oppress its own people and also commit a lot of acts of terror and fund terrorist groups around the region, right? This is also true. My problem is that people for the sanctions and people for against the sanctions, they both dismiss the cost to their position as insignificant, right? So the people who are for the sanctions, they're saying like, why would you take these sanctions away? You're releasing funds to a violent dictatorship that is the main sponsor of terror. If you remove the sanctions, you're releasing the funds to them. And when you tell them like, what about the Iranian people who are suffering financially for the sanctions? They say that the sanctions is mostly hurting the regime, not the people. That's not true. It's hurting the regime and the people. Okay, but they are right about the fact that if you don't have the sanction, the regime, this evil regime, will have more resources. They are correct. But I don't like it when they dismiss the cost because the cost is high. Also, the people on the other side as well that are against the sanctions, they constantly measure how many Iranian people are suffering because of the sanctions, right? But they dismiss how important it is that the sanction is also handicapping a regime that is the main sponsor of terror. They downplay that part. So I think both sides are downplaying their part. I am personally for the sanctions, okay? Because there is no other way. I am for more targeted sanctions, but I know that's smart sanctions that finds a way and how to target the regime but not the people. But that is really difficult. Everything in Iran is so connected to the IRGC, which is the part of the regime that you want to target, that the entire economy is so connected to them that it's really hard to come up with a targeted smart sanction in a way that the people of Iran are not hurt. If there was a way to target the sanctions against the regime but not the people, obviously they would have gone for it by now. And they're trying to come up with better ways where they could target sanctions the regime but not the people. But it's not that easy. The reason why I am for sanctions, even with the cost, and again, I might be wrong, and I'm happy to be corrected on this. Okay? If I'm wrong, like, please correct me. I'm not married to this position. But there's only two other options. The other options are war and doing nothing. If there's any other option, let me know. If there's any other options beyond these three options, sanctions, war, doing nothing, against a regime that violates international norms and agreements and human rights and everything, and oppresses his own people. If you do nothing, that means the whole motto of never forget is nonsense, that the world stands by when cruelty happens to people. The punishing a regime, like it's like people who, I see so much hypocrisy from the left, people who support the sanctions on Russia but do not support the sanctions on Iran because of suffering of Iranian people. The sanctions on Russia is also hurting a lot of innocent Russians. Again, how could you support the sanctions on Russia knowing that innocent Russians are suffering because of the sanctions on Russia? But the cost of doing nothing is more. The norms and the standards that the international liberal order has come up with is the reason why we have some stability and some peace, more stability and peace than the world could have ever imagined ever since World War II. That needs to be protected. Violators of human rights should not be ignored. Their crimes should not just go unpunished. Doing nothing should not be an option. So if doing nothing is not an option, you have to choose between war and sanctions. War itself is not an option because that is also a violation of international norms that we're trying to protect. So that leaves us with nothing but sanctions. The sanctions, although many Iranian people are suffering from it, the sanctions have been forced upon them not by the international order that has accepted the sanctions, but by the regime itself. Do not blame the United States or the United Nations for their sanctions. Their hands were forced because war and doing nothing was out of question. The sanctions have been put upon the Iranian people by the regime itself. They are the ones responsible. That is my philosophy. That's how I argue. And if you disagree with that, let me know. Get my best-selling book, Why There Is No God, for free. Click on the link for it in the description.